Nobody expected the lecture hall to go quiet because of one sentence, especially not that sentence. "Who approved you for this class?" The professor didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words carried the weight of someone who had never been questioned in his life. Dozens of students froze in their seats. Laptops stopped clicking. Pens hovered mid-air. At the back of the room sat a young black student, shoulders squared, eyes forward, pretending not to feel every head slowly turning in his direction. His name was Marcus Reed, 19 years old, sophomore, scholarship student. And in that moment, he became the center of a room that had never really wanted him there. The professor adjusted his glasses, scanning the roster like he already knew the answer. "Mr. Reed," he said, dragging out the name. "Stand up." Marcus did. Not because he wanted to, but because he had learned early in life that refusing only made things worse. The professor tilted his head, studying him like a misfiled document. "Advanced mathematical theory," he said. "Not remedial algebra. Not statistics for non-majors. This class eliminates people." A few students chuckled nervously. The professor smiled. "Tell me," he continued, "was it a diversity committee, or did someone feel sorry for you?" The room laughed louder this time. Marcus stayed quiet. What nobody in that room understood, not the students, not the professor, not even the department chair who had approved his enrollment, was that this was not the first time Marcus Reed had been underestimated. And it would not be the last, but it would be the biggest mistake that professor ever made, because the equation he was about to write on that board was never supposed to be solved, and the student he chose to humiliate was the one person alive who already had. Marcus Reed had perfected the art of being invisible. He sat in the same seat every lecture, back row, aisle side, closest to the exit. He never raised his hand. Never volunteered an answer, never corrected a mistake, even when he noticed one. His grades were good, not great, just enough to stay enrolled, just enough to stay ignored. That was intentional. Marcus grew up watching what happened to kids who stood out too much, especially kids who looked like him. Teachers expected less, peers resented more, authority figures watched. "Closer!" So Marcus learned to disappear in plain sight. What nobody knew was that his silence wasn't confusion. It was control. At 16, Marcus was already solving problems most graduate students avoided. At 17, he was reading unpublished research papers for fun. At 19, he was sitting quietly in a lecture hall while a man with tenure assumed he didn't belong. And Marcus let him. Because Marcus carried a rule he never broke. Never reveal everything you know until you have to. That rule didn't come from a teacher. It came from his father, a man Marcus barely remembered, a man whose name had been erased. The professor turned toward the board. "I have something special prepared today," he announced, chalk already in hand. An equation. Students straightened. The professor's class had a reputation. People failed it more than any other course in the department, not because it was impossible, but because he enjoyed deciding who deserved to pass. "This problem," he said, "has defeated doctoral candidates, experienced researchers, people far more qualified than anyone in this room." He paused. "Anyone who solves it earns an automatic A for the semester." Gasps, whispers, shock. Then, he smiled. "But if you attempt it and fail, you drop a full letter grade immediately." Silence. No one moved. The professor scanned the room slowly, and then his eyes stopped. Back row, aisle seat, Marcus. "Mr. Reed," he said, "come down here." Marcus stood. His heart wasn't racing. His hands weren't shaking. What he felt instead was something heavier, recognition. The professor handed him the chalk. "You have 5 minutes," he said. "Prove me wrong." The chalk touched the board. Symbols appeared, complex, twisted, layered. An equation designed, not to teach, but to expose. Marcus stared at it, and something clicked. He had seen this before, not in a textbook, not online, but in an old notebook wrapped in duct tape and stored in a shoebox under his mother's bed. A notebook that belonged to his father. A notebook dated 25 years earlier. In the margin of one page were 3 words Marcus would never forget. Solved, alternate method. Marcus lifted the chalk, and the room stopped laughing. Marcus didn't rush. That alone unsettled the professor. Most students who stepped up to that board panicked. They scribbled nervously, erased constantly, glanced at the clock, and fell apart under pressure. Marcus did none of that. He studied the equation like it was familiar, like it had weight beyond the chalk lines drawn in front of him. The classroom watched in confusion as Marcus began writing. Not guesses, not fragments, not desperation, clean steps, logical progression. Each line flowed naturally into the next. At first, the students assumed he was wrong. That was easier than believing what they were seeing. A few whispered. Someone laughed quietly. The professor leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, already convinced this would end the same way it always did. But then something unexpected happened. The laughter stopped. A student in the front row leaned closer to her laptop, typing furiously. Another pulled out his phone, quietly snapping a picture of the board. A graduate assistant seated near the wall frowned, then stood up without realizing it. Because Marcus wasn't just attempting the equation, he was restructuring it. He wasn't following the traditional approach taught in textbooks. He was dismantling the problem entirely, reframing it from a different mathematical perspective, one that very few people ever considered because it required abandoning familiar shortcuts. The professor's smile faded. His fingers tightened around the armrest. He leaned forward. Marcus continued. Symbols filled the board, but instead of chaos, there was clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes from deep understanding, not memorization. By the time Marcus reached the midpoint of the equation, the professor stood up. "Stop," he said. Marcus paused and turned. "Yes, sir?" The professor cleared his throat. "This approach," he said slowly. "Where did you learn it?" Marcus hesitated for the first time, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he knew what the answer would lead to. "I didn't learn it here," Marcus said carefully. The professor stared at the board again, then at Marcus. "You're telling me," he said, "you independently developed a method that took professionals decades to even conceptualize?" Marcus didn't argue. "I'm telling you it works." The room was completely silent now. The professor turned back to the board, scanned every step again, then waved Marcus forward. "Finish it," he said. Marcus did. When the final solution appeared, the air in the lecture hall felt different. Heavy, pressurized, like something had cracked, open that couldn't be closed again. The graduate assistant whispered something to another faculty member seated in the back. The professor said nothing. For a long moment he just stared at the board. Then he laughed. But this time, the laughter sounded strained. "Well," he said, clapping once, sharply. "Congratulations, you solved it." Relief rippled through the room. Then he added, "But that doesn't prove originality." The silence returned. "Mathematics isn't about results," the professor continued. "It's about contribution, and I don't recall ever seeing your name attached to anything meaningful." Marcus felt it then, the shift. This was no longer about math. This was about control. The professor stepped closer to Marcus. "Tell me something," he said. "Do you even understand the historical significance of what you just wrote?" "Yes, sir," Marcus replied. "Oh?" The professor smiled thinly. "Then explain it." Marcus turned back to the board. He didn't repeat the steps. Instead, He explained why the equation mattered. He spoke about its origins, the flawed assumptions built into its original framework, the reason it resisted conventional solutions for so long. He spoke about alternative mathematical spaces, about symmetry breaking, about constraints no one wanted to question because doing so meant admitting earlier scholars were wrong. The professor's face went pale, because Marcus wasn't just explaining the equation, he was explaining a paper that had never been published, a paper that existed only in draft form, a paper the professor himself had written decades earlier and quietly abandoned when he realized someone else had already reached the same conclusions. The professor interrupted him sharply. "That's enough." Marcus stopped. The room felt tense now, confused, but alert. The professor turned to the class. "Everyone out," he said. "Now." Students hesitated. "I said now." They gathered their things slowly, whispering, glancing back at Marcus as they left. The graduate assistant lingered, then followed the others out. When the door finally closed, only two people remained, the professor and Marcus. The professor exhaled. "You shouldn't know that method," he said quietly. Marcus met his eyes. "My father did," he said. The professor froze. "What did you say?" "My father," Marcus repeated. "He wrote it down, years ago." The professor's hand trembled. "That's not possible." Marcus reached into his backpack and pulled out a worn notebook. The cover was cracked. The pages yellowed. The binding held together with duct tape. He placed it gently on the desk. The professor stared at it like it was a ghost. "What's your father's name?" he asked. Marcus swallowed. "Dr. Elijah Reed." The professor stepped back. That name hadn't been spoken in this building in over 25 years, and it was never supposed to be spoken again. The professor didn't sit back down. He couldn't. The name echoed in his head like a fracture line splitting something old and fragile. Dr. Elijah Reed wasn't just a memory. He was a problem. One the department had buried carefully, deliberately, and permanently, or so they thought. "Where is that notebook from?" the professor asked, his voice lower now, stripped of authority. Marcus didn't answer immediately. "My father kept it hidden," he said. "Not because it was unfinished, because people stopped listening when they saw his face." The professor turned away, pacing. Elijah Reed had been brilliant. Everyone knew that. He had solved problems senior faculty avoided. He challenged assumptions others treated as sacred, and that made him dangerous. Not wrong. Dangerous. "He refused to publish under another name," the professor muttered, more to himself than to Marcus. "Refused to dilute his work. Refused to play along." Marcus watched him carefully. "You took his ideas," Marcus said, then pretended he never existed. The professor stopped pacing. "That's not how academia works," he snapped. "Credit goes to those who survive long enough to claim it." Marcus shook his head. "No. Credit goes to those who are allowed to stay." The words landed hard. The professor looked at the notebook again, his hands trembling as he opened it. Page after page confirmed what he already feared: the handwriting, the annotations, the mathematical fingerprints no one else used. "This was never impossible," the professor whispered. "We just weren't ready to accept who solved it." Marcus stepped forward. "My father didn't quit," he said. He was pushed out. Grants disappeared. Invitations stopped. His lectures were quietly removed from the schedule. And when he tried to fight back, you all called him difficult. The professor closed the notebook. "You don't understand. What it was like back then," he said defensively. "The pressure, the donors, the politics." Marcus didn't raise his voice. "You erased him anyway." Silence filled the room. Outside, students were still gathered in the hallway. Word was spreading fast. Phones buzzed, whispers multiplied. The professor straightened his jacket. "This conversation ends here," he said. "Your solution will be acknowledged, quietly. No need to escalate things." Marcus looked at him. "No," he said. "That's not enough." The professor frowned. "You solved the equation. You'll receive credit. Isn't that what you want?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "I want my father's name restored." The professor laughed, sharp and brittle. "That would open doors better left closed." Marcus met his gaze. "Then you shouldn't have tried to humiliate me in front of everyone." The professor's jaw tightened. "You have no idea what you're asking." Marcus stepped back toward the board. "Yes," he said. "I do." He picked up the chalk again. "And so does everyone else." The lecture hall doors opened. Students filtered back in, uncertain, curious, sensing something had changed. Faculty members followed, then department heads, then someone Marcus didn't recognize. Older, composed, watching everything without expression. The professor returned to the front, visibly shaken. "We'll continue," he said too quickly. "Class dismissed early." No one moved. Marcus stepped forward. "Actually," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "there's something you should all see." The professor's eyes widened. "Marcus, this is not appropriate." Marcus ignored him and wrote a name across the board. "Dr. Elijah." Reed gasps rippled through the room. One of the older faculty members stiffened. "That's impossible," someone whispered. Marcus turned. "My father developed the framework used in this department's most cited research," he said. "But his name was removed when it became inconvenient." The professor tried to interrupt. Marcus continued. "This equation," he said, pointing to the board, "was labeled impossible. Not because it was unsolvable, but because acknowledging its solution meant acknowledging who solved it first." The older man near the back stepped forward. "That notebook," he said quietly. "May I see it?" Marcus handed it to him. The man flipped through the pages slowly. Then he closed. This is authentic," he said. The room went silent. The professor's face drained of color. The man looked at him. "You knew," he said. The professor said nothing. "You all knew," the man continued, addressing the faculty. "And you let it happen." Phones came, out openly now. Students recorded everything. The professor backed away from the podium. "This is getting out of hand," he said. "No," Marcus replied. "This is history correcting itself." The room no longer belonged to the professor. He could feel it in the way no one looked at him anymore. Eyes that once followed his every word now followed Marcus. Phones were held openly. No one tried to hide it. This wasn't a lecture anymore. It was a reckoning. The older man with the notebook stepped fully into the light. His voice was calm, but it carried weight, the kind earned over decades, not demanded by position. "I remember Elijah Reed," he said. "I reviewed his early work. Brilliant. Original. Too original for his time." The professor swallowed hard. "You were on the committee," the man continued. "You signed the recommendation." The professor's mouth opened, then closed again. There was no defense left that didn't sound like a confession. Marcus stood quietly, letting the truth do what it had waited years to do. "You labeled him uncooperative," the man said. "That was the word you used. Not incorrect, not unqualified. Uncooperative." A murmur rolled through the room. The professor finally spoke. "He refused compromise." "No," Marcus said calmly. "He refused erasure." That word landed harder than any accusation. The man with the notebook nodded slowly. "This department built its reputation on foundations it refused to credit. That ends today." The professor's hands trembled as he reached for the podium, but even the wood seemed to reject him. His authority had cracked, and everyone could see the fracture spreading. "What happens now?" a student asked from the back. The older man didn't hesitate. "Now the record is corrected. Publicly." The professor shook his head. "You can't undo decades with a chalkboard and a notebook." Marcus met his eyes. "No, but you can stop pretending they didn't happen." Silence followed. Heavy. Final. For the first time, the professor looked small. By evening, the hallway outside the lecture hall was packed. Not just students now. Faculty from other departments. Administrators. Even reporters who had caught wind of something unusual unfolding inside a university known for silence, not scandal. Marcus stood near the window, watching the campus lights flicker on. His phone buzzed constantly, but he didn't look at it. The older man approached him quietly. "Your father would be proud," he said. Marcus didn't answer right away. "He didn't want pride," Marcus said finally. "He wanted acknowledgement." The man nodded. "He'll have it." Inside the hall, a formal statement was being drafted. Names reviewed, citations corrected, papers amended. The kind of work institutions avoided because it required admitting they had been wrong. The professor sat alone at his desk, staring at nothing. For years, he had believed power protected him. That tenure was insulation. That silence was safety. He had been wrong. A clerk entered quietly. "They're asking for your resignation," she said. He didn't respond. "They want it tonight." Still nothing. Outside, Marcus stepped back, into the room. The professor looked up, eyes hollow. "You planned this," he said bitterly. Marcus shook his head. "No, you did. The moment you decided humiliation was easier than fairness." The professor looked away. "I didn't know it would come back like this," he whispered. Marcus's voice was steady. Truth always does. Weeks later, a new plaque appeared in the department hallway. Foundational research by Dr. Elijah. Reed students stopped to read it, some for a second, some much longer. Marcus walked past it every day, not for validation, not for revenge, for closure. His father attended his first lecture as a guest, sat quietly in the back, took no notes, said nothing until the end. "You didn't raise your voice," his father said afterward. "You didn't insult anyone." Marcus smiled slightly. "I learned from you." The story spread far beyond the campus. Articles, debates, panels. Some called it overdue. Others called it uncomfortable. Marcus didn't care what they called it, only that it happened. Because brilliance doesn't disappear when ignored. It waits. And sometimes it returns through someone young enough to be underestimated and strong enough not to break.